might be able to see it in the video, but over there is where the littlest one is kind of residing, so in that cave area there. And then the other one that I added has just really taken to the tank, like really well. This one here, you wouldn't even know that this was a new fish. Welcome to my channel. In this video today I'm going to talk about adding my 2 trewavasae and mbuna into my main African cichlid tank, which you can see here behind me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the preparation and the things that I considered before adding them, and then also talk about the process of adding them to minimize aggression and stress as much as possible. I'm going to show you how I did it so that you can get a bit of an idea of how you might like to add new African cichlids to an already established tank as well. But I think that one of the key things with adding new fish into a tank is that every tank is going to be unique. So there's going to be that combination of your circumstances and what your intuition tells you is going to work for your tank. And also it can be good to have those kind of general ideas and guidelines of what you might like to do, so then you can hopefully combine those two things together. If you're enjoying my content, I would love for you to subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up if you find it to be helpful. So I picked up my 2 little trewavasae and mbuna around about 2.5 weeks ago, and during that time I had them here in a quarantine tank that I set up. The reason that I put them in quarantine was for disease, to make sure they weren't going to introduce anything into my tank, but also equally so it was to minimize their stress. If you're getting new fish to put into an established tank, it's good to quarantine them, not just for disease, but also to get them accustomed to the water parameters that you're going to be adding them into. And also it can be pretty stressful for fish coming from the store and then getting put into a whole new environment. So if you do have the opportunity to be able to quarantine fish, I highly recommend doing it, because it's not only going to help with disease, but it's also going to help with minimizing their stress levels. The other thing that I considered doing was growing them out a little bit so that their size would be more similar to the fish that I already have in here. However, these fish aren't completely full grown yet, and the haps are still growing pretty quickly, so the same rate that they were growing in their quarantine tank was actually pretty similar to how these guys are growing. And the thing is, they're not so tiny that I worry about them getting eaten by the other fish that are in here. And I also have plenty of holy rock and caves for them to hide in. I've actually got a fry that grew up in this tank, and it managed to go from all the way tiny little baby size until the size it is now. And it did that by just hiding in the caves in the holy rock, and also just coming out every now and then and getting more confident as it grew bigger. That kind of gave me a bit of an indication that they should have enough hiding spots and be okay, even if there is that size difference. On the other hand too, if you add fish in that are huge and bigger than the occupants that you already have in your tank, then sometimes that can cause issues on its own, because then you're introducing new fish that have the potential to be quite dominant into your tank, and that could really upset the way that things are for the fish who have already established their hierarchy in there. The other thing that you might like to consider in terms of preparation is the number of fish that you're adding into your tank. It's always good to just add more than one. The reason being is that if you just add one fish, you can do it, but then you just increase the chance that the other fish are going to really single out that new fish and really focus on it. Whereas if you add a couple of fish, then at least you've got more than one to diffuse the attention that they're giving. And also, if you put those 2 fish in quarantine together, then they've got each other, so they might be a bit aggressive to each other if you've got 2 males, but they are pretty social fish, African cichlids. And I noticed that even with having 2 of them in quarantine, they just weren't really thriving in there, because they didn't have that social hierarchy and that sense of safety in numbers when it was just the 2 of them. And that will be amplified if you've just got 1 fish that's on its own too. So even though they can be pretty aggressive, part of that aggression is also what's just normal for them and part of their socializing. When it came to choosing the right time to add them in, it was about just over 2 weeks after their quarantine period. and I decided to not grow them out because of the reason I was saying before. I didn't like that it was just the two of them in there and they were hiding a lot, and I just didn't feel that they were actually flourishing in that quarantine tank, and the risk of adding them in at the size that they are now was more worth it than keeping them in that quarantine tank and having them not being able to socialize and have that opportunity to be a part of a hierarchy. One of the things that you can do to make sure that it's less stressful is having the lights dimmed down or turned off when you add them in. I chose to add my fish when it was the 1 hour of time where it's sunset for the lights, so that's when they're starting to dim down for nighttime. I chose this time because I wanted to have some light to be able to monitor and see what was happening, but I didn't want to have the lights on their full intensity so that it was super bright in there and increasing their level of stress. The other reason I chose this time is because I know that after my fish eat and it gets to those later hours, that they tend to be a little bit more calm. When the lights go off, they normally are sitting down the bottom of the tank and sometimes more like laying on the sand and stuff. So I felt that that was a good time for my tank to add my fish in. And this is where it kind of comes in what I was talking about before in terms of what feels right and what's intuitive to you. I made these decisions based on what I was seeing when I was looking at my fish when they were in quarantine and how they were behaving, and also based on my fish and how they've behaved towards the small fry that I had in there that was growing up. When I added them into the tank, I put them in a little container, so one fish in one container each, and I had their own water from their tank in there. And I did that instead of using a net because I just prefer doing that as a transition period rather than having them go from one body of water to the next. I find that it just makes it a bit smoother if they're in their own water and then you're just adding them into the tank with that water. I wouldn't do this if it was store water. The only reason that I did this was because I know the parameters are the same in each tank and I know that the water is fine in both of my tanks as well. Then that way you don't have the stress of them sitting in a net or getting caught in a net. And I also find that it's then easier to direct them where you want them to go, because if you put them in a container, then you can normally slowly put that down towards a cave system or an area where you've got ornaments and rocks and direct your new fish into there, opposed to if you do it in a net. Sometimes it's a little bit trickier to do that and they get a bit stressed out and freaked out, then dart off somewhere that you don't want them to go. The other thing I did too is I put a little shell in there, and that little shell was from their quarantine tank, and one of the mbuna really liked hiding in that shell while they were in there. So by putting that in the tank, then it also gave them something that they're familiar with, and hopefully that then minimises your fish's stress if you do that, because the environment's then not completely new. This takes me to my next point, which is around kind of shaking things up a bit for the fish that are already in there. So some people do this by moving their rocks around and therefore changing the territories that their fish have by doing that. I don't do that with my tank because my rocks are so heavy, I literally cannot lift most of them. So when I was putting in the fish, it actually kind of freaked my fish out a little bit because it was something they're not used to. It was something that was new. That was enough to shake things up enough that there was a bit of disarray in the tank and the fish were a bit confused. And by doing that, then the newcomers kind of join in with them, because one thing I notice about African cichlids is if you do scare them, they do tend to school and kind of stick together. And in a weird way, I feel as though that helps them to bond, because then they're actually allies with one another and protecting each other, opposed to being aggressive and competing with each other. The other thing that I recommend doing is feeding your fish before you add any new fish in. This can be a really good distraction for your main tank fish, but it also helps because they can get quite aggressive if there's scarcity. So if they feel that there's not enough food and they have to compete for each other for food. So by making sure they're well fed, you've got distracted fish that have something to do, but then also they're less likely to see the newcomers as a threat that they have to compete with for resources. The one other thing that's probably worthwhile mentioning is just about conspecific aggression. So when you are adding new fish into your tank, if you're going to be putting them in a quarantine tank together, it's good to make sure that you don't have fish that are the same colour as each other, because they tend to be aggressive towards fish that look the same as them, and they tend to breed with fish that look the same as them as well. And if you don't know whether you've got a male and female or two males, it's just a safer option to make sure that they look as different to each other as possible. And that's why I went with the red trewavasae and then the marmalade one, so that they didn't look like each other. The main concern that I had for adding them into my main tank is that I already have an OB zebra mbuna in there, and the OB zebra looks very similar to the marmalade trewavasae that I added in. And I was concerned that if they were going to be two males, that I was going to end up with some issues. However, I ended up being pretty lucky, because it turns out that it's actually a female trewavasae that I added in, and I know this because they bred with each other within less than 5 minutes of me adding the new fish in. So those two have really paired up together, and it's been pretty sweet to see, because they hang out together and the little trewavasae follows the big OB zebra around. Like I said at the beginning, always make sure that you try and use your intuition and be mindful of your situation and what your fish are like, because if you're paying attention, you'll normally get a pretty good idea of how things are going to go, and a good indication of how your fish are going to respond to having newcomers. But hopefully at the same time, having these tips and seeing how I did the process might give you ideas on how you might like to do it, and hopefully be helpful so that your process goes as stress-free and as good as possible. If you found this video to be helpful, I would love for you to give it a like and let me know what you thought in the comments down below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, I would absolutely love for you to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video.